Hello, my name is Lee Presser. This is my show. I speak frequently to very interesting people. Some of these conversations are so exciting, so intellectually stimulating, I thought others might like to listen in. This is the reason we started recording Conversation with Lee Presser.
Welcome to Conversation with Lee Presser. On January 2nd of this year, Saudi Arabia executed an outspoken Shiite cleric. He was one of 47 people put to death after being convicted of terrorism offenses. In response, Iranian protesters ransacked and set fire to the Saudi embassy in Tehran. The Saudi foreign minister then summoned the Iranian ambassador to Riyadh and handed him a statement of protest in severe language. The Saudi foreign minister also reminded the Iranian ambassador that the host government is responsible for protecting the Saudi embassy in Tehran, the Saudi Consulate in the city of Mashhad, and their employees. There's now great tension between the two main powers in the Middle East. Our guest today is Faizan Syed, the executive director of the St. Louis chapter of the Council on American-Islamic Relations. Mr. Syed is a graduate of Drake University, where he received a degree in political science. He is here to educate us about the realities of the political and religious tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Mr. Syed, welcome to Conversation.
Well, thank you so much for having me today.
Well, let's start back at the beginning. First of all, just from what I said there in my opening, to Americans sounded awfully familiar with unhappy Iranians burning down an embassy that's not theirs. And so I can understand the Saudi unhappiness because, as you know, embassies are sacrosanct. I mean, they're foreign territory. It's like an act of war to do something like this. So having said that, what's the situation now, as you understand it, between Saudi Arabia and Iran?
So that's a tremendous question. What's really going on is that you have two hegemonic powers, one on Saudi Arabia, and on the other end you have Iran. And these two nations are really using their power and their influence in order to gain more control and influence within the Middle East as much as possible. It's been said that there's a lot of tension also going on between a religious component, which is between Sunnis, which is predominantly Saudi Arabia, and Shia Iran. And that conflict is now beginning to boil up, and it's now beginning to take mainstream language within these two situations as well.
Why don't you briefly explain to people who don't know, when you talk about Sunni and Shia, what is it that those are two elements of the Muslim religion. I think most people know that. But why do these two people or these two groups come into conflict so often?
So let's just go into the origin of where these two groups came from. During the time of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who was Islam's prophet, there was only one group, one religion, no divisions.
This is somewhere around the year 600 AD?
Right, 600 AD or 1400 years ago. So after his death, there was a disagreement amongst his companions and the people who followed him on who should become the next leader of the Muslims. The majority of them picked the one who had best qualified, and you would call those people perhaps the Sunni Muslims. And then the Shiite Muslims are the ones who believe that governance of the Muslims should only be done by the family of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, along with his descendants. As time went on, especially during the third Khalifa with Uthman ibn Affan, there was a civil war between the Muslims, and one group of them supported Ali, who was the nephew of Muhammad, peace be upon him, while another group supported another individual named Muawiyah, which was in Damascus, Syria. To make a long story short, that is where the conflict started, on secession of who should lead the Muslim Ummah. The Shias today are really those who said that it should have been a relative, a blood relative of the Prophet, while the Sunnis would say, no, it can be really anybody as well. And initially, it was a political conflict between these two groups. In fact, Shia Muslims and Sunni Muslims, you could say, were political parties. And then later, as time went on, Shia Muslims created their own theology to back up their political movement. And that's where we are today. So around the world, there are 1.5 or so billion Muslims around the world. About 80 million of them are Shia. And the vast majority of them live in those areas that were politically and historically those who were against that political movement that I mentioned before. So they live in areas like Iran, a large portion of Iraq. And then the rest of the world.
Part of what used to be
Yes.
the Persian Empire.
Right, part of what used to be the Persian Empire as well. So that's where a large portion of them live. And in other parts of the world, you have pockets of Shia Muslims, but you don't have large segments of Shia Muslims. So what makes what's going on in Saudi Arabia and Iran quite interesting is that you do have the large community of Shias that represent Iran, but also a portion of Iraq, about half and half for simple stakes. So you can say Iraq is half Shia, half Sunni. And then you go into Syria, which is where there's a large population of Alawites, and then Hezbollah controls Lebanon.
Now, what's an Alawite? We hear this on the news. What is the term Alawite mean?
So Alawites are really far-flung people from what you call Orthodoxy Islam. It'd be equivalent to basically saying Mormons to Christianity. So this group of people were really mountain people before the colonialists, such as Great Britain, invaded that territory. A part of controlling a population even after you left is you make the minority population rule the majority population. And by doing so, you're able to influence that region long after you've left that area. So part of the British strategy was to allow the Alawites, which were a small segment of the population, become the dominant force within Syria as well. Political force within Syria.
So they were running a government.
Right, and they still are running the government. So for example, Bashar al-Assad in Syria, he's not Sunni, he's not Shia, he's Alawite, and the people who support him are Alawite. And the larger conflict that's going on right now is, of course, we know about the Syrian civil war. You have Iran who's supporting the Shia-led government of Iraq. They're also supporting the Alawite government, Bashar al-Assad government in Syria. And of course, they've had control over much of Lebanon with Hezbollah. And what they've been able to do, they've been able to create a geographic sphere of influence in that area with the support of Russia. And this is where Saudi Arabia also feels threatened by their expansion. One thing we have to realize is that the modern conflict is much more of a political conflict than it is a religious conflict. In fact, Saudi Arabia and Iran have had very strong relationships historically. So Saudi Arabia has had strong relationship with Iran, with the Shah of Iran that lasted till 1979 until that embassy, the U.S. embassy was attacked, and then those relations were a little bit fuzzled.
Wait,
Yes.
was the Pahlavi government, the Shah,
Yeah.
was he Shia or Sunni?
So the more accurate description of the Shah of Iran, he's secular. He's technically Shiite, but he's really secular. He doesn't really rule with any type of religious fervor, which is why there was a religious revolution in Iran that overthrew that government. But even after that, the Saudi government had very good relations with even President Ahmadinejad, the former president of the country of Iran. Recently, though, especially when the U.S. invaded Iraq, and there was, again, Iraq is, let's just say 50-50 Sunni and Shia. What you had within that country is when you have a vacuum of power, when Saddam Hussein was taken out, you had Sunni militias and Shia militias for the first time openly fighting each other within Iraq. And then as that conflict continued, especially once Nur al-Maliki, the former prime minister of Iraq before ISIS took over large territories in that area, he, as a prime minister, would start attacking Sunni tribes within Iraq as well in order to really...
Because he was Shia.
Of course, he's Shia. And the goal for Maliki, who is Shia, is to dominate the region and to really persecute the Sunnis, which is why when ISIS invaded Iraq, many of the Sunni tribes, seeing that the Shia government is oppressing them, they actually supported ISIS. Now, many of these tribes, of course, regret doing that for obvious reasons. So that is where the origin of the conflict is.
Now, pause
yes.
there for just a second. Going into Iraq, just want to talk about Iraq here for just a second. What I think I just heard you say was that Prime Minister Maliki either didn't believe in or was willing to throw away the concept of what in America and the West we call a liberal democracy or a Republican form of government in which these various groups meet in a council like Congress and then they hash things out there yelling at each other rather than shooting at each other.
That's right.
He's threw that away. Is that what I hear you saying?
That's right. So Nur al-Maliki, when President George Bush was in office, he had a lot of support and backing from the United States, and there are lots of American troops who would ensure that he would remain in power. Once President Obama took office, the political reality of that changed. The U.S. really wanted to pull out its troops and leave Iraq, and Nur al-Maliki, being a fairly paranoid individual, saw that as a threat to him. So he wanted to ensure that he would have total support with the backing of Iran, which of course ended up backfiring on him. And that's why there is that now Sunni Shia conflict within Iraq, mainly bolstered now by ISIS as well. As I mentioned,
this is a political, not a religious thing you're talking about. Is that right? Or is it mainly religious, not political?
So it is mainly political, because when Saddam Hussein was taken out, you have a vacuum of power, but it is now taking on religious undertones. So for example, if we take the exact execution, Saudi Arabia executed Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr.
Oh, now we're coming back to the beginning. Where
yeah, now we're coming back to the beginning.
All right, and this is on January 2nd of this year, 2016.
Right.
Okay.
So January 2nd, Saudi Arabia executes Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr, who's of course a Shia cleric. And for those of your guests who don't know, the eastern part of Saudi Arabia has a large Shia population, which is where Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr lived.
Iran.
Yes, very close to Iran. And when they executed him, the Iranian people, of course, responded by protests and creating a mob that then attacked the embassy. At that point, it is still much of a political issue. What happens next now brings it into somewhat of a religious issue, in that the Grand Ayatollah of Iran, who is basically the supreme leader of that country, came out and said to Saudi Arabia that you will have divine justice done unto you, that there will be a divine attack. And then Saudi Arabia responds by cutting ties to them, but also getting multiple Sunni countries to cut diplomatic ties with Iran, such as Sudan, such as Qatar, such as other nations as well. And part of all of this, though we can look at as a hegemonic struggle between two powers, on the ground level, you can't inspire people to fight for you over that type of theory. You really have to create a situation where people feel that they're fighting for, let's say in America, freedom, liberty, justice, or in that area, the Shias want to attack you and kill you. Look what they did in Iraq with their death squad. And the Sunnis can say, no, the Shias can say the Sunnis want to attack you. Look what they did to this peaceful sheikh, and see what's going on in that area. And so the conflict is taking on religious undertones as well. And one of the great struggles and the threat that we see is, if that continues, will these two powerful nations increase and ratchet up the tensions, or will they try to resolve the differences and not ratchet up? And I think it'd be interesting to see how that plays out.
Well, yes, and it's only been, let's see, today's the 26th of January, so we're only like about three and a half weeks since that incident occurred. The real question is, you have talked about two hegemonic powers, which would indicate two relatively strong militaries. But yet, when you look at these two, Iran actually, I mean, first of all, there's 75 million Iranians, 30 million Saudis, but living in Saudi Arabia. But they're not really all Saudis. A lot of them, right, are simply either guest workers, or they're not part of the Saudi group. And the Saudi military has been deliberately kept weak by the government, because they're afraid that if they make a strong military, it'll overthrow them. So you really do have I think, an imbalance here. I mean, if the United States and the other powers stay out of it, Iran might actually win that conflict.
For sure, Iran's military is a world-class military, and their soldiers are actually dedicated to the state, and they're battle-tested and hardened. So, and it's not only Iran's military. Now, if we expand the picture out, you realize that this isn't just a fight between Iran, Shia, and Sunni Saudi Arabia. You also have large world players as well. So the world players as well. So the people who are backing Iran are, of course, Russia primarily, and we see that in the Syrian civil war, and they have a purpose in order to really expand their influence in the Middle East. And with the Saudi side, you have a lot of Sunni nations who don't like what Iran is doing, especially in Syria with the support of Bashar al-Assad, and they don't like their expansion in other territories. So you have Saudi Arabia trying to capitalize over, you could call it Sunni fears, but also working with the United States and NATO in order to be that counterbalance. So though this could be, you could say this is a conflict just between these two nations, it is bringing in and is sucking in larger countries as well who have their own interests, and the United States does not want to see Russia have influence within the Middle East, and Russia wants to take away the influence that the United States has. So these larger nations are also in subversive ways fighting each other, but using, for example, Iran, but primarily Syria, in order to play out sort of that larger international tensions.
People who are listening to us need to understand that all of what we're talking about now actually goes back about 100 years. At one time, there was the Ottoman Empire. And just briefly tell people, what was the Ottoman Empire?
So the Islamic world, like much of the world, has been controlled by different empires. The most recent empire was the Ottoman Empire, who had their capital in modern-day Istanbul. And the Ottoman Empire controlled Turkey, but also controlled what we would call the Middle East: Egypt, Syria, Iraq, parts of Iran, and this area. So when they were in charge, you didn't have this constant warring within the Middle East. But once the Ottoman Empire basically collapsed after World War I.
Right there, let's just explain that during World War I, the Ottoman Empire was one of those empires that went out of business. And so at the end of the war, World War I, there was a pact between England and France to divide up the lands that used to belong to this other empire that was a Muslim empire, but then it was going to be controlled by the Christian empires, right? And so then they made all these lines on maps that really had little to do with the various families and religious affiliations, right?
That's right.
Right, and so from there, that's where a lot of this conflict actually began. Of course, it was held down, and you were just talking about this, when the United States and the Soviet Union faced each other. So much of this was tamped down because nobody dared to raise their hand against the Russians or the Americans. But once that came to an end in the 90s, that's when we start to see all this stuff that you're talking about bubbling up. Am I reading this correctly?
That's a very, very good reading of the Middle East. People have to understand, unlike the United States and other countries, the countries of the Middle East are really artificial boundaries. And what you're seeing is you're seeing the eventual collapse of these artificial boundaries within the Middle East. So for example, you could argue there is no more Syria. There is no more Iraq. Even in parts of Turkey, you have a large Kurdish population that are fighting the Islamic State. And once that battle's over, you will likely see them in the future try to take territory from Turkey. And as that region and these artificial lines basically begin to dissolve, you will see whichever power is able to capitalize on it can and will do so, which is what we see happening with Iran, taking territory really from their country all the way to Lebanon to the Mediterranean Sea.
Okay. That was my next question. Now, we hear the term caliphate.
That's right.
Okay, we hear it now. I'm not talking about from hundreds of years ago. We're talking about the establishment of a caliphate. Is what you just said that Iran wants to do, in other words, from the Persian territory of what's now called Iran, all the way to the Mediterranean, which would be over there by Israel, is this a caliphate? Is that what we're talking about? Or is this Iran wanting to enlarge its borders, like the Russians used to do, when they would suddenly capture a country and then all of a sudden, boom, it was part of their group and not a caliphate. I mean, it was just, hey, we control you.
So I would not use the term caliphate for describing what Iran is doing, because the caliphate has its own political implications. There's one leader, there's governors that govern underneath them. There's an entire sort of semi-federal system underneath it. What Iran is really doing is that they're using their influence to control regions of the Middle East by proxy. So for example, Iran doesn't have diplomats that control Iraq, but yet the leadership of Iraq, and especially the military, listen to Iranian advisors. Bashar al-Assad needs Iran to survive, so listens to what Iran does, and Hezbollah's main funding and weapons and training comes from Iran as well. So in a way, they're not a khalifa, they're more of sort of just an expanding, you could call them an empire, you could call them an expanding state. They're using existing systems, but their power political system where they have a lot more influence. So for example, if Iraq was stable, they would not need Iran. but Iraq is not stable. So the Shias in Iraq do need Iran. If Syria and Bashar al-Assad without Iran would have collapsed years ago, and there would be a completely different Syria right now. But because of Iran and with that Russia, they're able to continue, and so on and so forth. So that's what you see happening in that area. Now, I also have to take the flip side. Saudi Arabia is also trying to capitalize on this situation as well to spread their influence, to say that this is a war, we have to stop Iranian expansion. So by doing that, they're able to create allies from countries that historically may not be their allies, such as Jordan, such as Egypt, and other nations. And as this tension escalates and increases, of course, the human tragedy of what's going on in Syria is only going to get worse. And then the possibility for longer-term warfare within that region is only going to become more and more resolute and certain.
And this has nothing to do any longer with the United States or with Russia or France. These are issues in a family. It's a family squabble, isn't it? In many respects.
In many respects, it is. And what's happening with Russia, the United States, and France, and these other countries is that they are playing a role of allowing these nations to continue warfare. So, for example, when Iran and Iraq were fighting each other, and that was a very bloody war as well, the reason it lasted for such a long time is because Russia supported Iran, the United States supported Iraq, and these two countries by themselves, they cannot maintain a long-term war. But when you have other world powers who get into that region and they have their own objectives as well, you then see the tension escalating. One thing that gives Iran even more authority and more power is that the United States is now lifting sanctions on Iran, which now allows their economy to grow larger, which now then, of course, will allow their influence to grow as well.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. What is it that Iran, and by the way, we probably have about 6-7 minutes left here.
Okay.
What is it that Iran I think we know what Saudi Arabia wants. They want things to the status quo.
That's right.
What does Iran want? Or I know you can't speak for them, but what do you think that Iran or the leadership in Iran is thinking? This is our end game. We would like to be here 10 years from now, 20 years from now.
So that's the million-dollar question. What does Iran want? From a purely political understanding of how nation-states operate, every nation-state has an interest to basically become more powerful. And Iran right now is in that position to gain tremendous influence within the region. Of course, we just mentioned the United States is lifting the sanctions, which gives them access to hundreds of billions of dollars and gives their business more opportunity to then expand to the global market. Militarily,
they've been cut out of the world economy for a number of years now.
Yeah.
And as a matter of fact, I just saw that the Iranian Prime Minister was just in, where was it, Italy or France or somewhere. Anyways, signing contracts.
Yeah.
Signing contracts.
That's right. And
that's what Europeans want. They want to get back into the business of making money.
That's right. And again, as those sanctions get lifted more, because the initial sanctions are a partial lifting. There's not full lifting of sanctions. So as time goes on, Iran I believe, is going to become a much more powerful state economically. And with their economics, they've already used their military might in order to spread their influence. And I think that will likely increase as the years and the months go on as well. And of course their opposition, Saudi Arabia, you see they're going through a lot of internal crises right now. With a low cost of oil, Saudi Arabia is at $98 billion deficit of actually paying for government services. With that, you also have the king of Saudi Arabia is very old, very frail, and once he passes away, there might be internal strife on who's going to become the next king or the ruler of Saudi Arabia.
Pause there for just a second. Now, you were saying way back at the beginning of the religion that the Shia were about the succession has to be blood relative.
That's right.
And apparently Sunni were most competent. Okay, is that still the case today? Is there still this tension as to the succession process, whether it should be blood family or most competent?
That tension exists in religious circles. And again, when you have any type of warfare, you need to use the language that motivates people. So in that part of the world, the Sunni-Shia conflict motivates people. In the United States, the ability to go into other countries and ensure that there's democracy, there's liberty and freedom for all people, it motivates people to join the military and to get involved in other areas. So that's what's happening there. And I think as this plays out over the next several years, because this isn't a few weeks, but this is a several-year process, you will see a strengthening of Iran, and with that, a strengthening of the Russian position within the Middle East, and you might see a weakening of the United States and NATO's positioning within that region as well. And as long as that continues, I think what might end up happening is that unless Saudi Arabia is able to mount a successful counter to Iran's influence, you'll only see that influence getting stronger and stronger, and you'll see the Saudis' influence weakening, and with that, of course, many of the region also weakening as well. I think that'll be the long-term play. Of course, the question is, how does that affect the United States? I think the United States has done a very smart decision by opening up their relations with Iran, because this way, whether Saudi or Iran, whoever wins, our interests are still maintained within that region. So I think from that angle, we're in a very positive stance. But again, how it's all going to play out, it's going to be very interesting to see that happen over the years.
So in the last couple of minutes here, briefly describe what is ISIS, who are these people, and why are they so angry?
So that's a tremendous question. ISIS
Get 3 minutes.
Oh, 3 minutes. Okay, I'll do it very quickly. The modern day ISIS movement is a result of political vacuums within the region. And the people who are in charge of ISIS, many of those leadership are the former Saddam Hussein Ba'athist leadership. So they were leaders and they're the rulers of Iraq during Saddam Hussein. When the United States invaded, they fired the entire leadership, and then they have now created the ranks of ISIS. ISIS is really a cult, and they are a very angry group of people whose idea it is to create a so-called Islamic State and then to brutalize and to frighten people in order to maintain their particular territory.
Now, they're mainly Sunni?
They're 100% Sunni.
100% Sunni.
Yeah, they're not made. They're 100%
Because I was going to say, there is an Islamic Republic.
Yeah.
It's called Iran.
Yeah.
And so they want their own republic, or so-called, or what state, or whatever it is, Islamic State, right?
Yeah.
Is that?
So their origins are in the Syrian civil war. When Syria civil war started, there were multiple groups. One of those groups was basically a Sunni-led group who are more religious and more fundamental from that angle. And they were also supported with Al-Qaeda, with al-Nusra Front, another terror group within that region. There's a split between Al-Qaeda, and a group of Al-Qaeda says we should only fight Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Another group, who are the younger people, and of course younger people are always more radical than older, wiser individuals, they said, no, we're going to expand our territory, we're going to create a state. And they're the ones that exploited the Nur al-Maliki, again he's Shia, exploitation of the Sunnis in Iraq, which is the border between Iraq and Syria. And then they went and they conquered large territories within Iraq, and they also hold large territories within Syria as well. So that is where their origin started, and that is where they began that's where they really began their existence. They use the strategy of terror and fear in order to keep control of the population they operate out of, but also they're following an old, basically terrorist strategy, which is how do you defeat the idea of the United States and the West. Again, their purpose is not to kill American, but their purpose is to really destroy the idea. I see we're running out of time.
Apparently, I don't know where we are. I'm getting confusing time cues, but I think I need to say goodbye to the audience. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I've been speaking with Faizan Syed. He is with the St. Louis chapter of CAIR. We've had a very interesting discussion here today about the situation between Iran and Saudi Arabia, a discussion of the origins of the Islamic religion and where that stands today. We're going to be uploading this to YouTube so you can show it to your friends. Just go there, look at Conversation with Lee Presser and Mr. Syed. Thank you.